Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. We talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Ernest Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. I don't usually make videos like this, but there are really interesting times going on in college football with all of the realignment. And even though that talk has died down a bit, there are still two teams that are right now left out to dry. And I really think that a conference in the Power 5, or at this point the Power 4, needs to add Oregon State and Washington State, because if they don't, it just would not be right. And I understand that money is driving all of these moves, and Oregon State and Washington State might not be the most lucrative schools to add into a conference at this point, especially since the ACC, the SEC, the Big Ten, and the Big 12 have all kind of overloaded themselves with the amount of teams that they currently have, and it probably would not make sense for Oregon State or Washington State to be added to any of these conferences. But the Pac-12 has been completely decimated. Every single team in that conference has now been added to a conference. Cal and Stanford are going to the ACC. And then you have the Big 12 adding Utah, Arizona, Arizona State, and Colorado. And then the Big 10 adding the powerhouses in USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington. It wasn't as bad when you still had Cal and Stanford, Oregon State, and Washington State left. When those four teams were all left out to dry, it still was not a good situation. And still, I was hoping that other conferences would take those teams in. But if they did dissolve into the Mountain West, or if Mountain West teams did join the remaining Pac-4, it might have made a bit more sense. But to me, now that you have added Cal and Stanford to the ACC, even if there were teams in the ACC that didn't even want them added, they still got added anyway, along with SMU. And now all the realignment talk has died down, but Oregon State and Washington State are still sitting out there in the Pac-2. The remaining members of that dying conference after this season, all of these teams are going to be joining these new conferences. There will be no schedule that those two teams will be able to play. Oregon State and Washington State won't be able to play USC as a conference game anymore because they're going to be in the Big Ten. Who are they going to play? So they're going to have to make a decision really soon. But I would just hate to see those two teams, specifically Oregon State, but Washington State as well, fall back to the Mountain West. They've both been Power 5 teams for the last 60 to 80 years, and they deserve to still be in a power league, even if they aren't blue blood football programs or even just middle of the pack programs. A lot of people would look at them as toward the bottom of the barrel in Power 5 conferences, but Oregon State, especially lately, has been doing a lot better in football, and Washington State is still a solid program. I know there's a lot more involved than just your football program. It's your other sports as well, which neither Oregon State or Washington State's that good in basketball, and they do struggle in some other sports. And maybe in the academics department, they don't bring in the type revenue that a USC does, or an Oregon, or some of these other schools like Cal and Stanford that have great academics. But still, I think that these two schools specifically would fit in the Big 12 because of the fact that they've already added Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and Arizona State. That's 4 Pac-12 teams that Oregon State and Washington State can join and make it a 6-team contingent from the old Pac-12 in the Big 12. I know that the travel would be tough because of the fact they're in the Pacific Northwest, and the Big 12, even with the teams they've added, are geographically closer to the other teams that are in the conference. But still, having UCF in the Big 12 and then them having to go all the way to Arizona or Arizona State is not that much crazier than them having to go to Washington State or Oregon State. Again, maybe it wouldn't be lucrative enough financially for the Big 12 to add them, but to me, that's the conference that needs to add Oregon State and Washington State. I know they've already turned them down, but the Big 10 is not going to add either of those two teams. I just do not see it. I don't see the SEC adding Oregon State or Washington State either. They're probably the least likeliest of all the conferences to add. Maybe the Big 10 a little bit more because they do have Oregon and Washington, and they could add them to make the rivalry still be intact with those teams. But I just really don't see the Big 10 adding those teams because the Big 10 wants to add teams that are lucrative, and I just don't know if Oregon State and Washington State are lucrative enough. Maybe the Big 10 will be the second best option for those two schools, especially because of the rivalries. But I think the Big 12 needs to be the school to add them. The ACC probably won't add them either. I don't know if they're viable enough financially, and the ACC has already added the teams they've added in SMU, Cal, and Stanford. Stanford. I just don't really see them expanding any further. And I know the Big 12 is up to like 18 teams right now as we speak with all the teams that they've added, but really at this point having 20 teams in a conference would not be insane. That might even be where we're heading anyway, with the Big 10 possibly adding a couple ACC schools, or what if the SEC adds a few of those schools as well? That could put them up to 20 teams. So it wouldn't be insane for the Big 12. It would probably help them out and make their conference even a little bit stronger, especially on the gridiron with Oregon State if they continue to play at a high level. But my wish is just for Oregon State and Washington State to join a Power 4 league. I understand that looking at it from the standpoint, if the ACC eventually falls apart, what is going to happen to teams like Wake Forest and Syracuse and Boston College? Will the Big 12 add those teams? Will the American Conference add those teams? And if they go to the American Conference, that will be a downgrade. I know, just like if Oregon State and Washington State do go to the Mountain West, it will be a downgrade. But as of this time, I would just really like to see Oregon State, Washington State join the Big 12 or some other power league to be able to remain viable as a power conference team while all of these teams have not been relegated yet. There has not been one team that's been relegated to a smaller league as of now amid all of this realignment talk. You talk about one of the last teams for that to happen. It was Temple going from the Big East down to a smaller conference. They were one of the last teams to do that, and that made sense because in 15 years of being in the Big East, they didn't even have a better than 4-8 record. But at least with Oregon State, Washington State, they've had success in the Pac-12, and I think they could have success in the Big 12. And even, again, if more realignment does occur in the future, and maybe some teams get dropped from being a power conference team, if you do have some of the ACC teams go to the Big 10 or the SEC, and some of those teams get left behind, but even then, maybe some of them could go to the Big 12. Who knows, but we're not at that point yet. It doesn't have to be this way. No one has to get left behind as of now. We could have 4 power conferences, even if the Big 10 and the SEC are ahead of the ACC and the Big 12. I feel like Oregon State and Washington State could go to the Big 12. It would help out the Big 12 to an extent, but it would definitely help out Oregon State and Washington State, and no power conference team has to get relegated like Temple did in the past. I think that is what should happen, but we're going to have to see in the coming days, weeks, months, and maybe even a couple of years to find out what's going to happen with this situation. But I will be sad to see Oregon State and Washington State relegated to the Mountain West, and I hope as of now, since no team has been relegated to a smaller conference, I hope the Big 12 or some of the conference does the right thing and adds Oregon State and Washington State to their league. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Comment down below whether you think that Oregon State and Washington State should join the Big 12 or some other power league, or whether you think they should be relegated to the Mountain West and that neither of those two teams are viable to be in a power league as of this time anymore. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.